The first thing that I will do is to stay stitch around the neckline and armhole curves. This is a longer stitch, about 6 to 8 stitches per inch. You can take a scrap and test it to see how it works on your fabric. And I'm starting at the shoulder inside the 1/4 inch seam allowance and working down to the center back of the blouse. I don't need to back tack because I will overlap the seams. The thing to do in this case is to work from the shoulder to center back and then flip it around and work from the other shoulder to center back. That way you're stitching in the same direction and pushing the fabric the same way. Because the stitching is overlapped at center back, you do not need to back tack. And at the armholes, start at the shoulder and work to the underarm, again inside the seam allowance. And the same on the front pieces. From the shoulder to the underarm at the armhole curve. And then from the shoulder down to center front neck and beyond if you would like. Repeating the same process on the other side of a front piece. What stay stitching does is help stabilize the fabric so that when you work with it, these curves don't stretch beyond the measurement that they are supposed to be. There are times that stay stitching will actually stretch the fabric itself, and in that case, if the fabric looks warped, which I will be teaching, I lay it back on top of the pattern piece and with the stay stitching threads, gently pull those threads so that the curve is back in shape aligned with the pattern piece. Now this is the upper collar. As you see, the interfacing is a little bit bigger than the upper collar, so I can baste it down and then trim off what is necessarily sticking out. The center back neck notches are aligned. And if you work from the center back out to either side, handling the fabric, it will be more uniform on each side. Now to baste these together, again inside the 1/4 inch seam allowance, so it marries the two fabrics. And when I go to sew the collar, the upper collar to the under collar, this will be nicely stabilized. You can see that the stitches are 3/8 to 1/2 inch apart. Different fabrics handle differently, so you'll have to experiment with the fabric you're using. If you make the stitches too tight, the piece, the upper collar, tends to shrink in a little bit. So you have to kind of gauge what is best for the fabric that you're working with. The reason I'm folding the fabric down like this is called roll of cloth. And when you have several layers and you roll them, the underneath layers need to be shorter. So I'm folding this as if it's being worn by the person, and that makes the interfacing, the white fabric, come away, move away from the blue fabric just a fraction, and I'll trim that off. There is at least one other segment on collars that will certainly discuss this much more thoroughly. If I sewed these two pieces completely flat together and then put the upper collar, the blue fabric, with the under collar, the other blue piece, the interfacing, the white fabric inside, would bunch up. So by making it a fraction, about a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch narrower from the top to the bottom of the collar, it helps the blue fabric roll on top of it and stand beautifully when the garment is completed. The stitches around the outside of the collar are much longer than the ones closer to the neck. I think the stitches in the neck interior need to be a little tighter because that area is going to be sewn differently. Also, the steps of sewing this before this collar is applied to the garment, I will have sewn the outside edge with the other blue piece, so that alone secures it. The reason to trim the white off rather than just leave it, I would not be able to stack the corresponding seam allowances from top to bottom collar if that was in the way. I'm looking at center front and measuring it because no, I'm sorry, that wasn't center front. That was the extension line. Center front is the red line. The line to the right of it, the first line, is the fold line. So I want to make sure that my measurements are correct. That is the very outer edge of the blouse. Now, by turning this edge in, this is a self-interfaced blouse. Of course, the right side of the fabric is face down, and I'm turning the facing in, so the wrong sides of the facing and body are together. Now, to sew the extension, what I'm going to do is fold back on the fold line at the first extension line and pin it down. In other words, the hard fold at the very edge of the garment. I'm just reinforcing that notch, the little clip. If you remember, the extension is about 1/2 inch. Reinforcing that notch. So what I did was pressed the facing and interfacing inside the blouse, and then I flipped it back on itself along the very far edge of the garment. And what I'm stitching is only the extension, and the seam allowance is 1/4 inch. So I'm going to embed the needle 1/2 of an inch away from that folded edge. I'm just back stitching one stitch, and rather than back tack at the very edge, I'm going to tie these threads. The reason is sometimes back tacking, even 1 or 2 stitches, pulls the fabric back with it and makes a pucker. So with a fragile fabric like this, I want to just tie it off. So when I flip that corner, it's a real clear corner. It's not rounded. Also, where I started the stitching, I'm actually tying that off. You can back tack or tie off. Tie off's a little more couture. Now I'm clipping. So this is a clapper with a point turner. If you have one, great. I'm snipping to the stitching line at the fold on the extension and pressing this with my fingers open. Then I'll press it with the iron, and I'm just pressing the extension only. If you don't have one of these tools, something else that works beautifully is a wooden chopstick, a fine-tipped wooden chopstick that doesn't have lacquer on it. Now, take your scissors or point turner. Point turner's the best. Or one of these little tools. This is a measuring tool for hems, but it has a nice point. And you put it in that fold and the pressed area and just flip it around on the metal piece, or if you have a wooden or plastic point turner. Then you can get a nice point. You can use your scissors, but you have to be very, very careful not to poke a hole with your scissors, which of course I have done countless times. Then this little area that's open at the top, the facing part that's not stitched, I'm just anchoring this with some stitches so it stays nice and flat, so that when I put the collar on it, it doesn't shift. Now you have the beautiful extension ready to eventually put the collar on. And now to do the same process on the other side. I'm stitching from the notch 1/2 of an inch from the folded edge, which is the extension, only the extension. I embed my needle right down at that 1/2 inch mark. It's a 1/4 inch seam. Stitch to the end. If you back tack, just make sure it doesn't make the fabric bunch up. It's easier if you just leave threads and pull them through and tie them off. Again, clip at the center front all the way to the seam, but not through the seam, and the folded edge. Press it open with your fingers. Hit it with a little steam, just that little 1/2 inch that's open. Take a point turner, place it in the corner, and you'll see how I flip the fabric around. And that helps me to push that point turner up into that fold and create a very nice point. And then basting shut the edge of the facing on the inside or the outside, it doesn't matter, just so that those seam allowances don't flip-flop around. They'll lay nice and flat this way. You don't have to knot this, just run your thread through it a few times. And hit it with some nice steam. You can see how nicely this lays now. It's just perfectly flat and a perfect right angle corner. Now let's address these darts. Right sides together, matching the dart leg notches. The pin is at the very tip of the dart. I like to press the dart first, and you do not press past that pin, which is the tip of the dart. That way, by pressing, it helps the fabric lay flat when you sew it. It doesn't shift. First, press with my fingers. Now to sew these, what I'm going to do is start at the notch and angle the fabric, angle the tip of the dart so that if I were just to let go, it would stitch a straight line. In other words, I'm not pulling the fabric as I work. I've already angled the fabric so that that needle will hit the tip of the dart. And as you see, the last 2 or 3 stitches are along the very, very edge of the fabric. That way you don't have a dimple at the tip of the dart. I'm tying these off 2 or 3 times, and I always leave about 1/2 inch of thread because I have noticed over the years, if I do not, sometimes the threads come untied, and then if you don't have at least 1/2 inch, you cannot retie them. You also could use your ruler and align the ruler with the notch and the pin that is at the tip of the dart and chalk the sewing line in. Now watch how I get very, very, very close, even though my fingers are kind of in the way. You can see I got very, very close to the edge of that fabric, just like a 32nd to a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge. And now to press these darts. And now to press these darts, I'm going to press them flat. I do not go past the tip, and I'm embedding the stitches and creasing the fold line a little bit more. I'm going to fold the dart down with the wrong side against the ham. And as you see, I'm pulling that tip so I don't press it flat. And this is a better way even to find a place on the ham where the tip is kind of on a curve that it fits beautifully. Now you can see the press line through there. See that press line that I'm pointing to? I'll show you how to get rid of it. There's several ways. First, just lift it up and press it with some steam. All of this is an initial press. When the garment's done, I'll give it a final press. This is another way to press this dart because it does show the press line on the right side, and that's not something that you want to show. So I'm taking a piece of fabric, I'm taking muslin, folding it, so I have a couple of thicknesses of it. And place it under the dart. Fold your dart down, and now press. I'm pressing mostly from the seam line and above, not pressing the bottom of the dart. And see, now you don't have it. You can still see the dart a little bit, but not like before. Now to do the shoulder seam and seams and the side seams. And these are patterned at 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to do French seams, which means I will start with the wrong sides together. And that's because on a French seam, you actually seam the fabric twice, as you will see. So my wrong side is up of the back, and that would be the right front piece, even though it's on the left side of the screen. I'm putting wrong sides together, and I have a generous seam allowance, 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is stitch it at half of that, which is 3/8 of an inch. You can see where the notch is. That's at the 3/4 inch, so that's where the final seam will be. But for now, I'm going to start at 3/8 of an inch. I back tacked one stitch, stitch straight across. Some people never back tack, they just tie everything, but my machine doesn't seem to gather the fabric up. It's a really good machine for back tacking. So again, wrong sides together. Three-eighths of an inch seam allowance. And of course, seam allowance is somewhat subjective. You may decide that you want a different seam allowance on your garments for different reasons. Embed your stitches with a little steam. And trim them. I'm going to trim to about 1/4 of an inch. Maybe a little bit less, 3/16, 1/4. press the seam open. And what you're looking at is the right side of the fabric, but now flip it and fold it right on that seam line. Press it again, and if we do another 3/8 of an inch, we will have sewn the entire 3/4 inch seam allowance. We'll have a French seam, and now what I'm pinning is right sides of the garment together. Because the first seam was trimmed less than 3/8, it will be encased in the second seam. You won't see it at all. So now what I can do is just follow the notches when I go to stitch. I'm looking for that little notch. Embed my stitch, lower the foot. I just held it in place, which is the same as back tacking in a way, and stitch across. And what a beautiful seam. The outer edge is basically another seam, and the raw edge is inside. This is a French seam. Isn't that lovely? Once again, let's embed those stitches. It'll help the final press look really, really good. I find that pressing is as important as sewing. Now, flip the seam toward the back of the garment and give it a little seam. I'm not putting much pressure on it so it won't show a line. Now actually, these are not going to be French seams. These are going to be turn and stitch seams, so you'll get the experience of doing different ones. The French seams at the shoulders are perfect. Once you do French seams, because they're very small in the final analysis, you can't really let the garment out if the person wearing the garment needs to have an alteration. They've gained weight, for instance. So a turn and stitch seam will still give me all of the seam allowance and a beautiful finish. You notice how I'm pulling that corner, not the sewn end of the dart, but the folded end. I'm pulling it in just a fraction. If you pull it tight into the seam allowance, it'll make the garment pucker at that area. So I'm giving myself a normal stitch, 10 to 12 stitches per inch, as all the other seams are, and at a 3/4 inch seam allowance, stitching straight down the garment from the armhole to the hem. This fabric does not fray terribly, so the turn-in stitch seam allowance is really, really nice, the seam finish. If it frayed terribly, I would probably zigzag the edges. Press your seam flat, embedding the stitches. So that I do a fold that's very uniform, I like to make a stitching line first. So at just a fraction under 1/4 inch, I'm stitching a straight line. This will give me a hard ridge to fold under. If you do it by eye and just fold it by your hands without doing this first, you can do it. But on a fragile fabric like this, it won't be as uniform. So for me, it makes more sense to take that extra time. It's just probably 1 minute to do all 4 seams. And then when I fold it under and stitch it, as you will soon see, it's a much straighter seam. Just a little area that I don't think looks as good as it can, so I'm going to take that out and resew it. Instead of back tacking, you can just overlap the stitches as I'm doing. Now I have that little ridge, and that helps me to fold it under and stitch it down close to the fold, very close to the fold. This is called turn and stitch. Again, pressing the seam flat. It makes for much more professional pressing if you do the many steps that I take. You can see what a nice seam finish this is. And still, if this model were to someday need to let this blouse out, I have some seam allowance left to work with. That's always an issue with custom clothing. I have learned over the years to, as much as possible, give wide seam allowances in the vertical seams, in most places that a person might need altering if their weight changes. And keep your scraps too, because sometimes you need it to insert gussets and such if a person's weight changes a lot. And repeating the same process on the other side. As you can see, I'm mostly pressing the center of the seam. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on the folded edges because that would make impressions just like that first dart that I pressed. And since I've already embedded the seams, they're fine, the folded edges of these seams. And now to work with the collar. I'm aligning the center back notches. The fabrics are right side together. And remember, the under collar is a little bit smaller than the upper collar. And I will stretch it to fit while I sew it. And that will help create the curve and the rise and fall of the collar so that it lays nicely on the body and doesn't stick out straight. You can see on the far right that little corner that's turned up. That's because the upper collar's on top and it's shorter, so it's pulling it up. But when the collar is turned right side out and put on the body, that little corner will turn down, which is what you want on a final blouse collar. So as you see, I'm pinning everything but the inside curve. I've matched the center back notch and then laid the fabric so it lines up beautifully. And now I'll stitch the seam at 1/4 of an inch. I'm stitching with the under collar on top. That's the smaller collar. And I'm forcing all of the edges to be together. When I get to the place to turn, I do 1 or 2 stitches diagonally across and then continue the seam. Stitching 1 or 2 inches diagonally at that little corner will actually make for a better 90-degree angle. Taking the pins out before I sew over them. Pulling those edges together. You can see at the upper curve, that one that's not being sewn, how much different in size the upper and under collar are. I've just gone past the center back notch. So I'll flip the fabric over and start in the same place, but this time, of course, the upper collar has to be on top. I could have just stitched all the way around, but this makes it a little more uniform. Here I come up to the corner, embed the needle, turn, 1 diagonal stitch, you could do 2, and then continue on. And I didn't back tack, I just overlapped the stitches. I'm comparing to make sure that those corners look the same. Embedding my stitches. Definitely clipping those threads because they might actually leave press marks if I don't. On the flat corners of the collar, I'm going to open the seam and press it flat. I press with my fingers first and then with the iron. Now this is a curved piece. It's not going to press easily. So you just have to do the best you can. Putting it on the ham, I have two hams, as you well know, one with a platform base and the one that's a free ham. So either one, putting the collar seam on the curve will enable me to press this open. The other side of the collar in this area I had pressed with this tool, so I'm going to press it a little bit on this side as well. Now, to trim some things and get rid of these basting threads, this is the thread that held the interfacing to the upper collar. I'm going to trim the interfacing away. I'm leaving only about 1/8 of an inch or 3/16 of an inch, mostly 1/8 of an inch all the way around. It's better to grade seam allowances in a collar, which means trim them so they're at different widths so that when you press them, they lay flatter. If you have all three seam allowances the same width and go to press the collar, it will leave an impression where the seam allowance is. Again, like that first bust dart that I pressed. Now trimming the corner. As you see, I'm doing 2 deep diagonals, and you want to leave just a fraction at the very tip of the corner, that 90-degree turn. You don't want to get so close that the seam falls apart, but I've trimmed, those diagonals are pretty deep. And now I'm trimming the under collar, not quite as much as the interfacing, but almost. And finally, a little bit from the upper collar. But I'm going to leave the upper collar with the widest seam allowance. And then clipping the curve. Turning the collar, you note where I'm putting the tip, turning the fabric on it. I'm pushing the little tool in just a little bit. Now I have the upper collar closest to the table on the downside. And what I'm doing is rolling that seam in so you see the seam. It's just a fraction of an inch, but you don't want the seam to be at the edge of the fold because it can be seen when the person is wearing the garment. So I roll this in just a fraction. Look how nice and flat that edge is now. It's all about learning to handle the fabrics. And you can see at the unsewn edge, the curve that's not sewn, the upper collar is still larger than the under collar. So when I sew it onto the body of the garment, you'll understand what this does. Now I'm comparing the lengths of these two collar ends. These are the points of the collar. I want to make sure the points look the same and that the lengths of that edge, that's about 2.25 inches, you want to make sure that those are the same before you sew it onto the garment, because it's really easy in sewing to have one a little bit shorter or longer than the other one. Rolling the edges of that straight line in. And now our collar is just about ready to put on the garment. If these aren't the same and they're a fraction off, you can trim off the longer one from the unsewn edge. If it's just a fraction. If it's more, then you'll probably want to resew it. Now, this is the upper collar, and I'm sewing this line at just under 1/4 inch because I'm going to be rolling this under, just like I did the turn and stitch seams. I'm going to roll it under and sew this part by hand when I'm applying it to the body of the garment. And this gives me a nice even edge to work with. So looking for my center back notch on the body and the collar. Oh yes, understitching. Okay, back to the drawing board or the sewing machine. So what I'm doing now, I'm going to sew on the outside of the fabric. I'm going to sew the seam allowance toward the under collar, because when this is worn, dry cleaned, washed, that wonderfully pressed seam could roll out and show. So this is called understitching, and you'll see what I'm doing. I'm making sure that the seam allowance underneath is going toward the under collar, the uninterfaced side. I'm making sure that that seam is very, very flat and sewing right next to it, about 1/8 inch next to it. Yep, see, I pointed, so you'll see that the seam allowance continues to go toward the under collar. This stabilizes the collar and keeps that seam from rolling around and showing over time and with wear. And you can see how it's coming out of the back of the needle, how very, very close to the seam it is, about 1/16 to 1/8 inch away from the seam. Many times I do this by hand, but this collar is not difficult to handle and it sews well with the sewing machine. I can't get too close to the edges without creating a problem, so I'll go as close as possible. Pull the threads through and tie them off. If the fabric was very, very thin, I wouldn't even tie them with a knot. I just pull them through and then with a needle weave them into the seam allowance. So now to put the collar onto the blouse. Find the center back notch of the collar and line it up with the body's center back notch. The shoulder notches, and in between. I pinned the seam allowance down so that it doesn't flip to the other direction in sewing. And then the center front of the collar meets the center front of the blouse. And the upper collar, as you see, is loose. It's not pinned down at all. Shoulder notch. Stabilizing the seam allowance the correct direction. It will be much easier to sew the collar to the blouse with a sewing machine if it's already basted first. So I'm going to hand baste this, and I'm starting at the center front. I'm avoiding the seam allowance of the collar and just basting either on the 1/4 inch seam allowance or very, very close to it and inside of it. Of course, when I've stitched the collar with the machine, if any of this stitching shows, it can be pulled away. It's much more accurate to baste it first because the two fabrics want to slip away from each other sometime when they're under the sewing machine needle. And by basting it, I've secured them, and it just makes the whole process much easier and quicker in the long run. I make less mistakes. And when I get to center front, I'll just secure that with a couple of stitches going back and forth. No need to knot it off. And now what I'm going to do is sew directionally. In other words, I'm going to start at the shoulder seam and work down to center back, a little past center back notch at the neckline, and then flip it, start at the other shoulder seam and go down and just a little bit past center back so that the stitches overlap and do not need to be tied. Now starting at the shoulder seam and working toward the center front. When you get close to the collar tip, which is at center front, it's a little trickier to handle this fabric. So instead of back tacking, I'm just going to leave a long tail so that if I have to sew a little bit by hand, I can do so. And to center front. Now, if everything's good, you can just tie it off. But if there's a problem, use a needle and thread the needle with the long tail, bring it through to the other side. This way you can adjust the stitches if needed, or at that point just tie them off as I'm doing now. I can see that the stitches need to be adjusted a little bit. My stitching didn't get quite to the point that I want, so by using the needle you can just go over the stitches by hand, tiny, tiny little stitches, and then tie them off. Now I see some basting stitches under the collar that can be pulled away. Now to press that seam very carefully, embedding the stitches. Pulling out some basting thread. And now to fold under that seam allowance where I stitched for a guideline and press it down. You can see I'm folding it so that the white stitching is on the underneath side. So hopefully it won't show when I'm finished with the blouse, but of course that too could be removed if necessary. But that does hold the interfacing to the fashion fabric, so I'd like to just leave it. Matching the center back notches and pinning the seam allowances on top of each other. If you noticed, I did not clip the curve of the neckline on the body or the collar. That's because this seam allowance inside the collar is not going to turn down on itself. It's actually going to stay going in a vertical up position, and that helps support the collar. It's not like, for instance, the facing of a deep neckline. That would need to be turned down because the facing and the seam allowances flip away from the original direction of the seam allowance. This does not. The seam allowance stays in the same orientation. It goes up into the collar. You want to wrap these seam allowances around each other so they lay nice and flat. That's just going to take a little bit of practice. Taking out some of the stitching, the interfacing will be okay. It's just this area that I'm taking it out because I don't want it to show. And when I hand stitch this, I can go through enough layers that it will catch the interfacing so it will not shift around. Trimming a little bit of the excess seam allowance away. And it's all coming together.